She grabbed the wrong black woman's arm, and the whole HOA paid the price. The moment her fingers closed around my arm in front of 40 witnesses, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not anger, just a cold, familiar stillness I hadn't felt since Kandahar. She had no idea what she'd just woken up. "You do not speak at this meeting unless I give you the floor," Sandra Whitmore screamed, her face flushing crimson under the fluorescent lights of the Maplewood HOA community room, her pearl necklace trembling. The whole room went silent. Nobody moved. Nobody helped. I looked down at her hand on my arm, manicured nails, diamond tennis bracelet, and then I looked her dead in the eyes and said, very quietly, "Let go of me, right now." She didn't. That was her first mistake. It would not be her last. My name is Denise Caldwell. I'm 38 years old, a 7th grade history teacher at Jefferson Middle School, and I've lived at 14 Birchwood Lane in the Maplewood Commons subdivision for just over 2 years now. My daughter Amara is 11, obsessed with marine biology and the color yellow, and she makes the best scrambled eggs in the state of Georgia. My husband Marcus travels for work 3 weeks out of 4, which means most days it's just me, Amara, and our beagle, Scout. I bought this house because the school district was excellent, the street was quiet, and the neighbors waved when you pulled into your driveway. I didn't buy it to spend my evenings defending my right to exist in it. The Maplewood Commons HOA had been run by Sandra Whitmore for 11 years. 11 years of newsletters with passive-aggressive footnotes, 11 years of selectively enforced bylaws, 11 years of whoever Sandra liked getting a pass and whoever she didn't getting fined. Sandra was 62, a retired pharmaceutical sales rep with a husband named Glenn, who I had never once seen speak above a murmur in her presence. She wore Lilly Pulitzer in summer and Talbots in winter and treated the HOA board like it was a seat on the Supreme Court. The first time I met her was 3 weeks after I moved in. She appeared at my door at 7:45 on a Saturday morning holding a laminated copy of the community guidelines and informed me that my moving truck had blocked the sidewalk for 11 minutes past the permitted window. I had been awake since 5 a.m. carrying boxes in 90-degree heat. My back hurt. Amara was crying because her fish tank had cracked in the truck, and this woman was standing on my porch lecturing me about 11 minutes. I smiled and apologized. I should have known then. By the end of my first month, I had received 3 written notices. One for my recycling bin being placed 6 inches too far from the curb. One for a wind chime Amara had hung on the back porch, which was not visible from any public street. And one for unregistered landscaping modifications, because I planted tulips. My neighbor Pat Okonkwo, who has lived on the street for 8 years, told me over the fence one afternoon that she'd never gotten a single notice in her first year. Pat is white. I am not. I filed the observation quietly in the back of my mind and kept my yard immaculate. Sandra ran the HOA board with 4 other members. Tom Briggs, her golf buddy who voted however she told him. Renee Castillo, who was terrified of her. Dave Huang, who was new and trying to stay neutral. And Carol Austin, a retired teacher who was the only one who ever pushed back. Carol had pulled me aside after my second board meeting and said, low-voiced, "She does this to anyone she sees as a threat. You moved in with a nice car and a nice house and she couldn't place you in the box she wanted. So now she's watching you." Carol had been on the board for 6 years. She knew Sandra down to the bone. The first real confrontation wasn't about my house at all. It was about the community pool. Maplewood Commons had a pool reserved for residents, and Sandra had recently installed a sign-in sheet requiring photo ID to enter. Every resident, every time. I had lived on this street for 8 months. I paid HOA dues of $412 a month. I had my ID checked at the pool 6 times in 2 weeks. My neighbors, many of whom I'd never seen sign anything, walked in without a glance. I documented every instance with my phone's timestamp. When I raised the issue at the September board meeting, Sandra cut me off mid-sentence. "The policy applies to all residents equally," she said, with the smile of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and has decided there's no consequence for it. Tom Briggs nodded. Renee looked at her hands. After the meeting, a woman named Brenda Kowalski introduced herself in the parking lot. She was a paralegal, she told me, and she'd seen what Sandra had done with that sign-in sheet before. It had been tried 3 years ago and quietly dropped after a fair housing complaint was filed. She handed me her card. I went home, put Amara to bed, poured a glass of wine, and spent 2 hours reading the Georgia Fair Housing Act. I had been a soldier. I knew that when you're outgunned, you don't charge, you gather intelligence, you build your position, and you wait for the right moment. October passed without major incident. Sandra sent a notice about my front porch light being on after 11 p.m., a rule I had not known existed. She had driven past my house at 11:30 to check. I found that out from my Ring camera footage, which caught her sedan slowing in front of my house. I began keeping a log. Date, time, incident, evidence. I had kept similar logs in the Army observation reports, incident documentation. Old habits. The kind Sandra Whitmore had no idea I possessed and no reason to suspect. In November, Amara's class did a heritage project and she made a beautiful poster about our family history. Gullah Geechee roots on my mother's side, Caribbean on Marcus's. She was so proud of it. She asked if we could hang it in the front window for a week. I said yes without thinking twice. The notice arrived the next morning. Unauthorized signage displayed in residential window. See HOA Guidelines, Section 4, Paragraph 11. I looked up Section 4, Paragraph 11. Covered commercial advertising. My daughter's school project was not a commercial advertisement. I wrote back and said so, with the relevant legal definitions included. Sandra replied that the board's interpretation of the guidelines was final. I forwarded the exchange to Brenda Kowalski and filed it in my log. 12 incidents in 4 months. I hadn't raised my voice once. December brought the holiday decoration contest. Sandra organized it every year, judged it herself, awarded a $50 gift card to the home that best captures the spirit of Maplewood Commons. Amara wanted us to enter. We put up lights, a wreath, and a small nativity scene. We did not win. The Hendersons 3 doors down won every year. The Hendersons were Sandra's tennis partners. I asked Dave Huang after the December board meeting how the judging was scored. He looked uncomfortable and said there was no formal rubric. I thanked him and wrote it down. Carol Austin caught my eye across the parking lot and gave me a small, knowing nod. January. A pipe burst in my garage and I had to bring in a plumber on a weekend. The repair required temporary equipment to be stored on my driveway for 48 hours. I received a notice before the plumber had even left. Unauthorized storage of equipment in residential driveway. I called the number on the notice. Sandra answered personally. "Mrs. Caldwell, the appearance of our community reflects on all of us," she said, in the measured tone of someone reading from a script they've used 100 times. I said I understood perfectly, and that I would be consulting the HOA's governing documents regarding emergency repair exemptions. The line went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Of course," and hung up. That night I emailed Brenda. 17 incidents in 6 months. I was keeping my powder dry, but I was also starting to understand that Sandra wasn't just difficult. She was strategic. She knew exactly how far to push without crossing a line she couldn't explain away. She'd been doing this a long time. In February, something changed. A new family moved in 3 houses down from Sandra. The Robinsons. Terrence and Yvette Robinson, both black, both professionals. He was a cardiologist. She ran a nonprofit. Their house was beautiful. Within 2 weeks, Yvette told me she'd received 4 HOA notices. I was not surprised. The February board meeting was the first time I brought documentation. Not complaints, documentation. A 3-page summary with attached exhibits. The sign-in sheet records, the notice about Amara's poster, the emergency repair notice, 3 others. I presented it calmly, requested the board review enforcement consistency, and sat down. Sandra smiled the entire time I spoke. It was the smile of someone who is not listening to what you're saying but is already thinking about what they'll do to you afterward. When I finished, she said, "Thank you for your feedback, Mrs. Caldwell. The board will take it under advisement." Tom Briggs didn't look up from his phone. The retaliation came within 72 hours. I received notice that my property would be subject to a special compliance inspection within 30 days. This was not a standard procedure. It was invented. I checked every governing document we had. There was no such thing as a special compliance inspection in the bylaws. I called Carol Austin. She sighed and said Sandra had pulled something similar with the last person who'd raised enforcement concerns, a man named Fiedler who'd moved out the following spring. "She grinds people down," Carol said. "Most people eventually just decide the fight isn't worth it." I told Carol I was not most people. Carol laughed, surprised. Yvette Robinson came to my door the first Saturday in March with a bottle of wine and what turned out to be an hour's worth of stories. The HOA had cited her for having a car parked in her own driveway. Her second car, legally owned, properly registered, claiming it violated a single-vehicle residential display rule. No such rule existed in writing. Yvette was furious. She was also sharp, organized, and had already photographed 12 other driveways on our street with 2 or more cars parked without any notice. She had a spreadsheet. I told her about my log. We looked at each other and we both understood. We were not going to file one complaint. We were going to build an airtight case. We brought in Brenda Kowalski on a 3-way call the following Tuesday. Brenda walked us through Georgia Fair housing regulations, HOA dispute procedures, and the specific grounds for a complaint to the Georgia Real Estate Commission. She mentioned that if a pattern of selective enforcement could be documented, it could rise to the level of federal fair housing violations. I wrote that down twice. Carol Austin agreed to meet us for coffee on a Thursday morning. She brought something I hadn't expected. Records. 6 years of board meeting minutes she had personally kept. "I always thought someone might need these someday," she said. She pushed them across the table like she'd been waiting a long time to do it. Among Carol's records was something that stopped my breath. A 2019 email chain in which Sandra had explicitly discussed flagging properties of new residents who may not share community values for increased monitoring. She had sent it to Tom Briggs and one other board member who had since moved away. Carol had printed it and held onto it for 4 years. I stared at that email for a long time. Community values. 2 words doing a lot of work. I photographed it and sent it to Brenda before I left the coffee shop. Brenda called me back within the hour. "This," she said, "is the document that changes everything." Yvette and I began attending every board meeting. Every single one. We sat in the front row. We asked procedural questions. We requested documents in writing. Sandra's smile became thinner each time. By April, Renee Castillo had started avoiding eye contact with Sandra during meetings, which I noted as a small but significant crack. At the April meeting, I raised the matter of the invented special compliance inspection. I read the relevant bylaw sections aloud, pointed out that no such procedure existed in the governing documents, and asked Sandra to cite the authority under which it had been issued. She said the board had broad discretionary authority. I asked her to point to where in the bylaws that phrase appeared. She couldn't. Tom Briggs jumped in to say the board had always operated this way, and that residents were expected to cooperate. I asked him when this policy had been adopted, by what vote, and where it was recorded in meeting minutes. He looked at his phone. Carol Austin said quietly, "I don't believe it was ever formally adopted." Sandra shot her a look that could strip paint. The meeting ended with Sandra tabling the issue for further board review. After everyone left, Dave Huang caught up with me in the parking lot. He had the look of someone who had been uncomfortable for a long time without knowing what to do about it. He said, "What you're doing, the documentation, she's not used to that." Dave told me something else. Sandra had been in contact with a real estate attorney, not about the HOA's legal exposure, but about finding grounds to disqualify certain homeowners from board membership. The attorney had apparently told her the grounds would need to involve actual bylaw violations. Sandra had then, Dave believed, begun engineering reasons to issue more violations to me and Yvette. I thanked Dave and drove home. I sat in my driveway for 5 minutes before going inside. Amara was at the kitchen table doing homework. Scout was asleep under the table. I looked at my daughter's yellow backpack hung on the chair and I thought, this is my home. I earned this home. I served for this home. I am not leaving. I called Marcus that night. He was in Denver for a client presentation. He listened to everything and then said, "Den, do you want me to come home?" I said no. I told him I had it handled. He laughed softly and said, "God help Sandra Whitmore." He knew me well. In May, Sandra escalated in a way that surprised even Carol. She pushed through a new rule at a board meeting, a rule about prior notification requirements for any resident organized community gathering of 3 or more people. The vote was 3-2. Carol and Dave voted no. The new rule was aimed at Yvette and me. We had been meeting with other residents, quietly, informally, to share information and build community. Sandra had gotten wind of it. The rule was her way of criminalizing our conversations. I recognized the tactic immediately. I had seen it used by people in positions of small power who feared losing it. Brenda said the rule almost certainly violated Georgia's HOA statutes regarding restraint of assembly and would not survive a legal challenge. But Sandra knew that. She didn't need the rule to survive. She needed it to scare people. I had seen this too. Intimidation as a substitute for authority. I was not scared. I was calculating. And I was almost ready. Yvette and I began quietly reaching out to other homeowners who had received disproportionate enforcement. An elderly Vietnamese couple cited 6 times for their garden ornaments. A young Latino family told. Their food truck, legally parked, once, for a birthday party, violated commercial use restrictions, and 2 women in a same-sex partnership who had received more than a dozen notices in 18 months. 8 households. 14 documented enforcement actions we believed were selective, retaliatory, or without legal basis. We had photographs, emails, time-stamped camera footage, and Carol's 6 years of minutes. Brenda had reviewed everything and was ready to file. We were just waiting for Sandra to go too far in public. For her to do something in front of witnesses that couldn't be explained away. Something that would crystallize everything we documented into a moment the whole community could see clearly. She gave it to us on a Tuesday night in June, at the quarterly HOA community meeting, in front of 43 residents, 2 board members who had brought their spouses, and a local newspaper reporter who covered neighborhood affairs for the Maplewood Courier and had been tipped off by Carol that the meeting might be interesting. The community meeting was held at 7 p.m. in the Maplewood Commons clubhouse. Sandra had arranged the chairs in a configuration that put the board at a raised table at the front and residents in rows facing them, like a courtroom where the judge had also written the laws. I noted the arrangement but said nothing. I had come prepared. In my tote bag, a printed copy of the Georgia HOA Dispute Resolution Act, my personal incident log with all attached exhibits, 3 copies of Brenda's formal complaint letter, and a voice recorder. which was legal in Georgia without the other party's consent as long as I was present. Old habits. Yvette sat beside me. Brenda was 3 rows back. Carol was at the board table, her face a careful neutral. Dave Huang sat at the end of the board table looking like a man waiting for a weather system to pass over. Tom Briggs was already talking to Sandra in low tones when we arrived. Renee had not come, which was new. Sandra opened the meeting with her usual efficiency. Budget update, landscaping vendor change, pool schedule reminder. Moving through items like someone who believed the faster you moved, the less time there was for anyone to ask questions. She was right about that. She had refined this method over 11 years. I raised my hand during the open comment period. Sandra looked at me for a fraction of a second too long before recognizing me. Mrs. Caldwell, you have 3 minutes. I stood up. Thank you, Sandra. I'd like to present the board and the community with documentation of a pattern of selective and discriminatory HOA enforcement going back over 18 months. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for someone to finish. The electric quiet of people who have just realized they are in the room where something important is about to happen. I heard a chair creak behind me. The reporter from the Courier, I would later learn, had just opened a fresh page in her notebook. I spoke clearly and without rushing. I outlined the discrepancies in enforcement. I named the households, with their permission, who had been targeted. I referenced the 2019 email about monitoring residents who may not share community values. I did not accuse Sandra by name of racism. I did not need to. The pattern spoke. I let it speak. Sandra interrupted me at the 2-minute mark. Mrs. Caldwell, I'm going to have to ask you to keep your comments to documented fact and refrain from speculation. I looked at her. Everything I have stated is documented fact, I said. I have copies available for any resident who would like one. I held up the stack of papers. 7 hands went up immediately. Sandra stood. This is not the appropriate venue for individual grievances. The board has a process. The board's process, I said, still calm, is what I'm here to discuss. Specifically, the lack of any impartial review mechanism for enforcement decisions and the board's failure to follow its own governing documents on multiple occasions. Somewhere in the back, someone said, "Amen," under their breath. Sandra's face changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I had spent years reading rooms and reading people in situations where reading them wrong could kill you. What I saw in her face was not anger. It was the expression of someone who has just realized they are losing control of a situation they thought they had locked down. She said, sharply, I think we all need to remember that this board has served this community faithfully for over a decade, and I will not stand here and allow unsubstantiated accusations. They're not unsubstantiated, Carol Austin said from the board table. The room held its breath. Sandra turned to look at Carol with an expression I can only describe as volcanic. Excuse me? The incidents Mrs. Caldwell is citing are real, Carol said. She didn't look at Sandra. She looked at the room. I've watched this happen for years. I've kept records because I believed this day would come. She reached into her folder and produced her own stack of printed minutes. These are board meeting minutes going back to 2018. I'd like to enter them into tonight's meeting record. Sandra's voice dropped to a register I hadn't heard before. Controlled, almost quiet, and exactly as dangerous as it sounded. Carol, I strongly suggest you consider what you're doing very carefully. Carol looked at her for a moment, then looked back at the room. I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago, she said. I'm sorry it took me this long. Tom Briggs made a motion to table all resident comments until a future special session. Sandra seconded immediately and called the vote before Dave Huang could object. Dave voted no. Carol voted no. 3-2 in favor of tabling. I had expected this. I stood back up. I'd like to note for the record that the vote to table this discussion prevents the community from hearing time-sensitive information regarding a complaint that will be filed with the Georgia Real Estate Commission within the next 48 hours. The reporter's pen had not stopped moving for 5 minutes. Sandra heard that sentence and something shifted in her posture. A stiffening that was not confidence but fear wearing confidence as a mask. She said, "This meeting is adjourned." And then she did the thing that ended her. She stepped down from the raised platform, crossed the room in 7 quick strides, and grabbed my arm. Not touched, grabbed. Her fingers closed above my elbow, hard, the way you grab someone when you intend to move them. Her voice was low and tight and intended only for me. "You are making a very serious mistake. This community does not need people like you causing trouble." I looked at her hand on my arm. I looked at her face. And I said very quietly, "Let go of me." She didn't. Her grip tightened. In my peripheral vision, I saw Yvette stand up. I heard the reporter's chair scrape. And I felt, in the precise center of my chest, the stillness of someone who has been in much worse situations than this and knows exactly what to do. "Let go of my arm," I said again at normal conversational volume, so that everyone in the room could hear me clearly. "Or I will remove your hand myself and this entire room will be witness to physical contact initiated by the HOA board president during an official community meeting. I am a former Army combat veteran and I am asking you, for the last time, to let go." Sandra let go. She stepped back. Her face was the color of old chalk. The room was absolutely silent. The reporter was writing. Yvette had her phone out. Dave Huang was staring at the table. Tom Briggs had gone very still. Carol Austin was looking at Sandra with an expression that was equal parts sadness and resolution. Sandra looked at the room, at 40 faces looking back at her, and for one unguarded second I saw her understand exactly what she had just done, in front of 40 witnesses, a member of the press, and a woman who had just calmly and clearly announced her own military service. Then she composed herself, turned, and walked out of the clubhouse. The room erupted. Not in the chaotic way, in the way of people who have been holding something back for a long time and have just been given permission to release it. Multiple people were talking at once. Someone came up to me and said, "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to do that." The reporter introduced herself as Gail Tran and asked if I was willing to give a statement. I said yes. I gave Gail Tran 40 minutes in the parking lot. I was careful and precise. I documented what had happened, the grab, the words, the context. I gave her the printed materials I had brought. She told me she had been looking at the Maplewood Commons HOA for 2 months following a tip from a former resident who had moved out after being driven out by enforcement. I told her the former resident's name was probably Fiedler. She said yes. On the drive home, I called Brenda. "File it," I said. "File everything. Tomorrow morning." Brenda said, "I was waiting for your call. It's ready." I thanked her and hung up. My hands were perfectly steady on the steering wheel. Then I thought about the phone call I was going to have to make, the one I hadn't planned on, but that the events of the night had made necessary. I called Colonel James Weatherford. Jimmy, my old commanding officer from Fort Benning, who now worked in the Georgia Attorney General's office. We hadn't spoken in 8 months. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Send me everything. All of it." I said I would. He said, "Den, you haven't changed a bit." I said I hoped so. I walked into my house, locked the door, sat down on the kitchen floor next to Scout, and let myself feel, for exactly 10 minutes, everything I had been holding at arm's length for 6 months. The frustration, the exhaustion, the grinding indignity of being surveilled in your own home, of having your daughter's school project called a violation. Then I got up, washed my face, and made a list. The list had 3 items: file complaint with Georgia Real Estate Commission, file complaint with HUD's Fair Housing Office, call the school board. That last item was new, because something Gail Tran had mentioned in the parking lot had just clicked into place and changed everything I thought I knew about Sandra Whitmore. Gail had said, "You know she sits on the county school board's community advisory panel, right? Has for 3 years." I had not known that. I thought about what that meant. Sandra Whitmore, a woman I now had on record making statements about people who may not share community values, who had just physically grabbed a black teacher in front of witnesses, had a formal advisory role in the same school district where I taught 7th grade. I went very still in my kitchen. Amara was asleep upstairs. Scout was eating. The refrigerator hummed. And I thought, she has been the same person in 2 different rooms, and no one has ever connected the rooms. Until now. Marcus called from Denver at 11 p.m. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "So she grabbed you?" I said yes. He said, "In front of witnesses?" I said yes. He said, "And you stayed completely calm?" I said yes. Another pause. Then, "I need to come home." I said that would be good. I slept 5 hours that night. More than I expected. Old soldier's trick. Rest when you can, because you don't know when you'll get the chance again. I was up at 5 a.m., coffee on, laptop open, organizing files. I was precise and methodical, and I was not angry. Anger is a luxury. Strategy is a tool. Marcus landed at noon the next day. He walked in the door, hugged me for 30 seconds without saying anything, and then said, "Show me the documentation." He sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours going through everything. He's an attorney. Not a housing attorney, but an attorney. And when he looked up, he said, "Den, this is more than an HOA complaint. You know that." I said I knew. The complaint was filed with the Georgia Real Estate Commission at 10:47 a.m. that Wednesday. Brenda sent me the confirmation email. 27 pages of documentation, 3 named complainants, 8 supporting households, and the 2019 email as the cornerstone exhibit. Brenda called it the most organized complaint I've filed in 11 years of practice. The HUD complaint went in at 2 p.m. That one named the specific federal statutes, Fair Housing Act, Section 804, and documented the pattern of racially disparate enforcement. It would take months to investigate. But HUD complaints are public record once filed, and once filed, they do not disappear quietly. I didn't hear from Sandra that day. What I did hear from at 4:15 p.m. was Gail Tran. Her article about the June HOA meeting would run in Thursday's Maplewood Courier. She had quotes from 6 residents present at the meeting, a statement from Carol Austin, a statement from me, and a request for comment from Sandra that had gone unanswered. Carol called me Thursday morning, before I'd even had my second cup of coffee. "The article is up," she said. Her voice was almost giddy, which I had never heard from Carol. "It's not just in the print edition. The Courier put it on their social media, and it's been shared 400 times already." I said I'd read it. She said, "Denise, she's on the county school board's advisory panel. Does the school board know about this?" I said they were about to. I sent a formal letter, not an email, a letter, to the superintendent of the Maplewood County School District that afternoon. I attached the Courier article, the HUD complaint summary, the 2019 email, and the first-hand account of Sandra Whitmore grabbing my arm at a public meeting. I referenced my employment as a teacher in the district. I requested that the superintendent review whether Sandra's continued role on the advisory panel was appropriate. I sent copies to the school board chair, the district's equity and inclusion director, and, on Carol's advice, to the district's Parent-Teacher Association leadership. Carol had been a teacher for 31 years. She knew exactly who needed to see what. By Friday afternoon, the Maplewood Courier article had been picked up by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's neighborhood section. Gail Tran texted me, "AJC just called me. You're going to have a bigger audience than you planned." I texted back, "Good, I meant it." Sandra had still not responded publicly. But Dave Huang called me Friday evening, sounding rattled. "She's called an emergency board meeting for Sunday. She's not telling anyone what it's about." I said that was fine. I would be there. He said, "Denise, be careful. When she gets cornered, she gets creative." I thanked him for the warning and thought, I've been in corners before. On Saturday, something unexpected happened. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize, Georgia area code. I answered. The voice on the other end was older, female, measured. "Mrs. Caldwell? My name is Eleanor Briggs. I'm Tom's mother." I said nothing, waiting. She said, "I've seen the news about the HOA. I want you to know. Tom's not a bad man. He's a frightened one. And I think he's about to do something that frightens me." Eleanor Briggs told me that Sandra had called Tom that morning and told him he needed to submit a written affidavit to the HOA's attorney stating that I had acted aggressively at the Tuesday meeting, that my behavior had been threatening, and that Sandra had grabbed my arm in self-defense. I listened without speaking. 43 witnesses. A reporter. A voice recording I had made myself. "I raised my son to be better than this," Eleanor Briggs said. Her voice was thin with something between exhaustion and grief. "He needs to know that lying in an affidavit, even for the HOA, is perjury." I said, "Mrs. Briggs, does Tom know you're calling me?" She said, "No, but he will." We talked for 12 more minutes. By the end, she was crying softly. I was not. I called Brenda immediately after. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Soliciting a false affidavit. That's a whole different category of problem for Sandra." She said she would note it in the file and, if Tom submitted such a document, they would pursue it as obstruction. Brenda said, "Denise, I want you to know, this is the cleanest case I have ever worked. You have built this brick by brick." I said I'd had good teachers, Army and otherwise. The Sunday emergency board meeting arrived. Sandra had sent a notice to residents on Saturday evening, vague, official sounding, citing important community matters requiring immediate board action. I arrived 15 minutes early. Yvette was already there. Brenda sat in the back. Carol was at the board table, her folder in front of her. Tom Briggs arrived looking like he had not slept. He did not look at me. Dave Huang arrived last, slipped into his seat, and immediately slid a folded piece of paper across the table to Carol without making eye contact with Sandra. Carol read it, folded it back, and put it in her folder. I caught Dave's eye for just a moment. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. Something had just happened that I did not yet fully understand. But I would soon. Sandra called the Sunday meeting to order with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She presented it as a community unity session, a chance for the board to address recent misunderstandings and recommit to the values that make Maplewood Commons exceptional. I sat in the front row with my hands folded and said nothing. I was very good at saying nothing. She presented a one-page document she called a Community Harmony Accord, a list of vague aspirational statements about neighborly respect and positive engagement that was, in effect, an attempt to get residents to sign something that would muddy the documentation trail we had built. I recognized it immediately. It was the same technique used by corporations doing damage control before litigation. Brenda saw it too. She raised her hand from the back of the room and asked, very politely, whether residents were being asked to sign this document, whether signing was mandatory, what legal effect the document was intended to have, and whether the HOA's attorney had drafted it. Sandra's smile flickered. She said it was voluntary and aspirational. Brenda said, "Thank you. I'd like a copy for my records." She already had her phone out. Tom Briggs looked at the floor the entire meeting. He did not speak. He did not second any of Sandra's motions. When Sandra made a procedural motion to formally reprimand Carol for unauthorized distribution of board documents at the Tuesday meeting, Tom did not raise his hand. The motion died for lack of a second. Sandra looked at him. He looked at the floor. After the meeting in the parking lot, Tom Briggs walked up to me. He looked older than he had even a week ago. He said very quietly, "I didn't sign the affidavit." I said, "I know." He looked at me with something that was almost surprise. I said, "Your mother called me." He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry. I should have said something a long time ago." I said, "Yes, but you didn't sign the affidavit. Start there." He nodded and walked to his car. That Sunday evening was, for one brief window, almost quiet. Marcus made dinner. Amara showed me a poster she'd been working on for the marine biology unit. A gorgeous hand-drawn diagram of a bioluminescent jellyfish, labeled in her careful 11-year-old handwriting. I taped it to the refrigerator and stood there looking at it for a long moment, thinking about everything this house was supposed to be. Everything it was going to be. The quiet didn't last. Monday morning I received a certified letter, not from the HOA but from a private attorney named Raymond Colt, representing Sandra L. Whitmore in her personal capacity. It was a defamation cease and desist. It alleged that my public statements about Sandra had damaged her reputation and caused material harm, and demanded that I retract all statements made to press within 10 days or face litigation. I called Marcus from the school parking lot. He read the letter while I held the phone and then said, "She's panicking." I said I agreed. He said, "Defamation requires the statements to be false. Everything you've said is documented. This letter has no legal teeth." I said I knew. He said, "But it's designed to scare you." I said I also knew that. I was not scared. I forwarded the cease and desist to Brenda and to Colonel Weatherford. Brenda responded within an hour. "Do not retract anything. I'll draft a response." Weatherford called me at lunch and said 2 words. "Good. More." I had not heard those 2 words from him since Kandahar, when I'd brought him a field report he hadn't expected. It meant things were moving. Gail Tran called me Tuesday morning. "I've received a cease and desist from Sandra Whitmore's attorney telling me not to publish anything further," she said. She sounded calm. "I wanted you to know so you're not blindsided. My editor has referred it to our paper's legal counsel." She paused. "Also, I've been contacted by 2 television news producers from the Atlanta market. They want to know if you'd be willing to talk." I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 3 hours. Then I called Brenda. She said, "The more documentation in the public record before any investigation closes, the better. But be measured. Don't perform. Just tell the truth." That was essentially what I had been doing for 18 months. I called Gail back and said yes. The segment ran on the Thursday evening news, Atlanta's Channel 11, 6 o'clock broadcast. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. They used a photo of me that I hadn't known they had, taken apparently at a school event where I'd been photographed at the front of a classroom. I looked composed and professional. Good. They ran a short clip of Carol Austin speaking to camera outside the clubhouse. They used the phrase, "alleged pattern of racially discriminatory enforcement," 6 times in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I counted. They showed the 2019 email on screen, with Sandra's name visible. They noted that Sandra Whitmore had not responded to repeated requests for comment. Sandra responded that night on her personal Facebook page, which I was informed about by 3 separate neighbors. She posted a statement calling the media coverage a coordinated attack by bad faith actors seeking to destroy a community that has stood for decades on principles of decency and mutual respect. She called me, without naming me, an outside agitator. That phrase was a mistake. It has a specific history, and it was going to follow her. By Friday morning, outside agitator had been quoted in 2 online local news aggregators and in a thread on a Maplewood Commons neighborhood app that had gone from 5 comments to 230 in 18 hours. Yvette screenshotted all of it and sent it to Brenda. Brenda added it to the file and said, "She keeps building the case for us." The following Monday, I arrived at Jefferson Middle School and was called to the principal's office before first period. My principal, Dr. Linda Park, closed the door and looked at me with the expression of someone carrying a message they wish they didn't have to deliver. She said, "Denise, I received a phone call Friday afternoon from a member of the school board advisory panel requesting an inquiry into whether a teacher at this school had been engaged in disruptive political activity." I sat across from Dr. Park and waited. She said, "The request was made by Sandra Whitmore." I said, "Of course it was." Dr. Park looked at me carefully. "I want you to know that I am not investigating you. I'm telling you this because I think you should know it happened, and because I've already contacted the district's legal department." I said, "Thank you, Linda." She nodded. "Also," she said, "I've already read the AJC article, and I watched the Channel 11 segment." She paused. "I'm proud of you." But here was the twist I had not anticipated. Dr. Park told me the district had launched its own review, not of me, but of Sandra's role on the advisory panel, and specifically whether her conduct, as documented, was consistent with the district's equity commitments. The equity director had requested the file I'd sent. The superintendent had personally responded to my letter. This had moved faster than I expected. Tuesday, a certified letter from the Georgia Real Estate Commission confirming receipt of our complaint and notifying Sandra that an investigation had been opened. She would be required to provide documentation and appear for an interview within 60 days. The letter was addressed to the HOA at Sandra's listed address. It was delivered while Sandra was hosting her weekly Tuesday morning tennis game. Her neighbor across the street, who had no love for Sandra, told me this with visible satisfaction. Wednesday, Colonel Weatherford called to tell me that the Attorney General's office had been monitoring the AJC coverage and that a deputy had flagged the HUD complaint as potentially connected to a broader pattern they were tracking in 2 other Georgia subdivisions. He couldn't tell me more than that, but his voice had the specific quality it got when he was telling me something was going well without technically saying so. Thursday, Sandra did something I had not expected. She called a town hall, not a board meeting, but a town hall, open to all Maplewood Commons residents. And she announced it via the HOA newsletter with a subject line that read, "The truth about what's happening in our community." I read the newsletter twice. It was desperate. She was trying to get in front of the narrative, but she was 2 weeks too late for that. I attended the town hall. I sat in the back. I brought my voice recorder. I brought Yvette. Brenda did not come. She said it was better that I not have visible legal representation at what Sandra was trying to frame as a community conversation. Carol came. She sat at the back with me and Yvette and did not say a word until Sandra gave her a reason to. Sandra opened the town hall by thanking everyone for coming and then spent 15 minutes painting herself as a victim. A woman who had given 11 years of volunteer service to this community, who had maintained property values and community standards through dedication and sacrifice, and who was now being targeted by people with political agendas. She never said what the agendas were. She didn't need to. The implication hung in the air. She showed a slide presentation. I want to be specific about this because it matters. Sandra Whitmore, HOA board president, had put together a PowerPoint presentation for her own defense at a community town hall. It had charts. It had before and after photos of neighborhood properties. It had a slide titled, "What Maplewood Commons Values," that listed things like pride of ownership, community harmony, and mutual respect. None of the slides addressed a single documented enforcement incident. During the Q&A period, a man named Gerald Webb, who had lived on Sycamore Court for 16 years and whom I had never spoken to, stood up and said, "Sandra, I've had 3 different families on my block receive notices in the past 2 years that I never received for the same things. I've been here for 16 years and I've never had a notice. Can you explain the difference?" Sandra said enforcement was consistent and based on documented violations. Gerald said, "Mine isn't documented. That's my question." Sandra moved to the next raised hand. Nadia Pham, the elderly Vietnamese woman I had mentioned in our complaint, stood up next and, in careful, precise English, read from a printed list the 6 notices she had received over 3 years for garden ornaments. She held up photographs. She said, "My neighbor 2 doors down has the same ornaments. 0 notices." She sat down. The room was uncomfortable in the way rooms get when the thing everyone has been avoiding has just walked in and sat down. 2 more people spoke before Sandra closed the Q&A, citing time constraints, with 4 hands still in the air. I did not speak. I did not need to. The room was speaking for me. After the town hall, 3 people I had never met came up to me in the parking lot. A man named Dale Hutchins who had moved out of Maplewood Commons 2 years ago. He'd driven back for this. He said, "I'm the Fiedler she drove out. I changed my name back. I want to give a statement." I gave him Brenda's number. My heart rate was steady. My hands were steady. Everything was steady. I want to pause here and say something true. There were moments in this fight when I was tired in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. Tired of being strategic. Tired of carrying the documentation. Tired of being the person who had to be right, precise, and unimpeachable every single moment because the cost of being anything less was losing. The Army prepared me for sustained operations. But it doesn't make them comfortable. It just makes them survivable. The week after the town hall, Sandra escalated in 2 directions simultaneously. The first direction, she had the HOA's attorney send a letter to Brenda alleging that my unauthorized solicitation of homeowner statements constituted tortious interference with the HOA's governance. This was legally creative and substantively groundless. Brenda laughed when she read it, but she also said, "She's spending real money on that attorney. She's scared." The second direction was harder to track but more dangerous. Sandra had begun privately contacting homeowners who had given us supporting statements, calling them at home, visiting in some cases, expressing concern for their standing in the community. She was not threatening them exactly. She was too careful for that. But she was reminding them, in that particular way she had, that she had been in this community a long time and knew everyone and that things had a way of being remembered. Nadia Pham called me in tears on a Thursday afternoon. Sandra had come to her door. Sandra had asked, very pleasantly, whether Nadia had been encouraged by outside parties to speak at the town hall. Nadia had said no. Sandra had nodded and said she was glad, because these situations can get complicated for people who aren't familiar with how things work here. Then she'd smiled and left. Nadia's hands had been shaking when she called me. I drove to Nadia's house that evening. I sat with her and her husband at their kitchen table and I told them what I knew about their rights as homeowners, as complainants, and as witnesses. I told them that what Sandra had done at their door, while it stopped short of an explicit threat, was documented intimidation, and that I was going to document it. I asked if they were willing to write down what Sandra had said. They were. They were also angry now in a way they hadn't been before. That anger was righteous and it was going to be useful. I emailed Brenda that night with Nadia's written account. Brenda said, "This is witness intimidation. It won't survive scrutiny. But it's also the behavior of someone who is out of options. She paused, then added, Denise, I need you to be ready for her to do something we haven't anticipated. When people run out of legal options, they sometimes make personal ones. I said I understood. I also upgraded my Ring camera system the next morning. Old habits. Marcus had extended his stay in Atlanta. He was working from home, managing his clients remotely. He didn't say he was worried about me. He never did that because he knew it made me feel handled. He just stayed. He made coffee in the mornings and drove Amara to school, and when I came home from long days with my jaw tight and my shoulders locked, he would put his hands on my shoulders from behind and press without saying anything. It helped more than words. Amara had noticed something was wrong. She was 11, not 6. She noticed everything. One evening at dinner she said very carefully, Mom, is the neighbor lady still bothering us? I looked at her and said yes, there was still a disagreement, but that it was being handled, and that our home was safe, and that sometimes adults had to fight for things they believed were right even when it was tiring. She considered this. Then she said, like in history? Like civil rights? I said exactly like that. She nodded seriously and went back to her eggs. In the third week after the town hall, something happened that Brenda had been tracking quietly. The HOA's insurance carrier, a company out of Dallas, that underwrote liability coverage for community associations, sent a notice to the HOA board requesting a meeting to discuss the pending complaints. This was not standard. It was extraordinary. It meant the insurer was considering whether the HOA's conduct had created liability exposure they hadn't priced for. Dave Huang called me after receiving the insurance notice. She doesn't know yet, he said. I'm the one who handles our paperwork and she hasn't opened this week's mail. But when she does, he didn't finish the sentence. I said, when she does, she's going to make another mistake. He said, that's what I'm afraid of. I said, I'm not. Sandra opened the mail on a Friday. I know this because she called an emergency board meeting that same afternoon, 3 p.m., 2 hours notice, and Dave texted me immediately. I was in the middle of a 7th grade lesson on the Civil War Reconstruction era, and I read the text under my desk and thought, the timing is interesting. I told my students we would continue Monday and let them out 3 minutes early. My hands were steady when I put my phone away. The emergency board meeting was not open to residents. Sandra had specified board members only in her notice. Dave was present. Carol was present. Tom Briggs was present. I know what happened at that meeting because both Dave and Carol called me separately afterward, within 20 minutes of each other. Sandra had presented a plan. The plan was to formally censure Carol Austin and Dave Huang for unauthorized disclosure of confidential board information and to initiate removal proceedings against them from the board. She had also drafted a letter to the HOA's attorney asking whether the board could file a countercomplaint with the Georgia Real Estate Commission against the residents who had complained, specifically against me and Yvette, for filing a malicious and unfounded complaint. Tom Briggs had voted against all of it. Every motion. He voted no on the censure, no on the removal proceedings, no on the countercomplaint letter. Carol and Dave had also voted no. Sandra had been outvoted 3-1. She had lost control of her own board. Dave told me Sandra had sat completely still for about 15 seconds after the final vote. Then she had picked up her papers, put them back in her folder, and said, in a voice he described as flat, like all the emotion had been drained out, that she was going to consult with her attorney about next steps. Then she walked out. No goodbye. No pleasantries. Just out. Carol said, I think we just broke something. I asked what she meant. She said, I think we broke the thing in her that believed she was untouchable. I thought about that for a moment. I said, Carol, she's going to come back harder. When that breaks in a person, they don't always get careful. Sometimes they just get reckless. Carol said, I know. I'll be ready. I said I would be too. 3 days later, Sandra sent an email to all Maplewood Commons residents from the official HOA address, without board approval, without putting it to a vote, without any of the standard procedures she had supposedly governed by for 11 years. It was a 3-paragraph email that accused Carol, Dave, and Tom of undermining the board's legal authority, and said she was placing the HOA under emergency governance protocols pending a legal review. There were no emergency governance protocols. I checked every document we had. Brenda checked. There was no such provision in the HOA's governing documents, its bylaws, or its rules and regulations. Sandra had invented a new legal framework in a 3-paragraph email at 11:30 p.m. on a Sunday night. Brenda forwarded it to Colonel Weatherford's office at 7 a.m. Monday morning with the subject line, Latest Exhibit. The email had one more effect that Sandra probably hadn't calculated. It panicked Renee Castillo. Renee had been absent from meetings and quiet for weeks, but that email apparently pushed her to a decision. She called me. I had never heard from Renee before ever and said, Mrs. Caldwell, I've been afraid of Sandra for 4 years. I want to give a statement. I know things. My voice was very calm when I said, Renee, I'm listening. Renee told me things I had suspected but hadn't been able to document. She told me about a meeting in 2021 where Sandra had explicitly told the board that a particular property on Elm Street, owned by a black family named the Washingtons, who had since moved, should be kept on notice to create grounds for enforcement that would encourage them to reconsider their fit with the community. She had said this out loud, in a board meeting, with no apparent concern for consequence. Renee had said nothing at the time. She had told herself it wasn't that bad, that she was misunderstanding, that Sandra's intentions were really just about property standards. She had said those things to herself for 4 years. I convinced myself, she told me, voice tight, because it was easier than the alternative. I said I understood how that happened. I did not judge her for it. I needed her clear-eyed and willing, not defensive. Renee's statement, when written and signed, was 5 pages long. It included dates, quotes, and the specific names of 3 families she had watched be targeted and eventually leave the neighborhood. Brenda added it to the file and called it the statement that turns a fair housing complaint into a textbook case. I printed a copy and put it in my filing cabinet next to my military discharge papers. That week, the school district completed its review and issued a statement. Sandra Whitmore's appointment to the Community Advisory Panel was being rescinded, effective immediately, pending the outcome of ongoing investigations into conduct inconsistent with the district's equity and inclusion commitments. The superintendent's office sent me a copy of the statement directly. Dr. Park walked into my classroom during my prep period and said, quietly, "You should know it happened. Good work." Then she left. I sat in my empty classroom for 10 minutes after Dr. Park left. My 7th graders had taped their Civil War research posters to the walls. There was one on John Lewis, one on Harriet Tubman, one on Ida B. Wells. I looked at Ida B. Wells's poster for a long time. She had kept records too. She had been precise and strategic and patient, and she had been a teacher. I thought that was worth noting. The following Monday, Sandra's attorney sent a letter withdrawing the defamation cease and desist. Our client has elected to pursue other remedies, the letter said, without specifying what remedies. Brenda said the withdrawal meant their own attorney had advised them the cease and desist was unwinnable. She's losing legal support, Brenda said. That's significant. Attorneys don't withdraw cease and desists because things are going well for their clients. I was at school when I got the news about the advisory panel. I taught 4 classes that day without mentioning any of it. I came home, changed out of my school clothes, sat on my back porch with Scout in my lap, and allowed myself 1 glass of wine and 5 full minutes of feeling good. Then I went back inside and reviewed our file for what was coming next. Because I knew what was coming next. I had been a soldier. I had watched enough tactical situations develop to know that when an opposing force loses a key position, it doesn't always retreat in order. Sometimes it charges. Sometimes it does something unhinged and costly and spectacular because the alternative, acknowledging defeat, is something certain kinds of people cannot do. Sandra Whitmore was that kind of person, and she was about to prove it. She started calling people. Not homeowners this time, people in Sandra's world. Her country club friends. Her church committees. People at the Maplewood County Chamber of Commerce, where she sat on an advisory board. People whose number she had and who might, in turn, call people who had some connection to my life or Marcus's or our community standing. I found out about this campaign because 3 separate people she'd called independently called me to tell me she'd reached out. One of them was a deacon from our church, First Baptist Maplewood, who called Marcus on a Tuesday evening to say that Sandra had asked him whether he knew anything concerning about our family. He had told her he did not and asked her not to contact him again. The deacon was furious. He told Marcus, "I've known you and Denise for years. Whatever that woman thinks she's doing, she's not going to find what she's looking for." Marcus thanked him and then sat at our kitchen table very quietly for a moment. Another was a woman I knew from the school district's parent engagement committee, a woman who had worked with me on a literacy initiative the prior spring. Sandra had called her and described me as someone engaged in a deliberate campaign to destabilize the community. The woman had texted me immediately, "What is happening?" Sandra Whitmore just called me and said some extremely strange things. I explained. The woman then went to the school board chair and told her what Sandra had done. The board chair documented it. The third call Sandra made was to Glenn Whitmore's employer. Glenn, who I had barely registered as a person separate from Sandra for 18 months, apparently worked as a financial advisor at a firm in Buckhead. Sandra had called his managing director. I still do not fully understand what she said or what she was trying to accomplish, and apparently suggested that Glenn's clients in Maplewood Commons might be reassessing their relationships due to the current situation. The managing director was bewildered. He called Glenn. Glenn called Sandra. What happened in that conversation I didn't learn until later. Much later. On a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after Sandra had lost the board vote, she showed up at Jefferson Middle School. Not to see me, to see Dr. Park. She had made an appointment under the name, a community member with concerns about staff conduct. Dr. Park's assistant had not recognized the name on the calendar until Sandra walked in. Dr. Park told me about it that evening, calling from her personal cell. "She sat across from me," she said, "and told me that you had been using school property, specifically school email, to coordinate your campaign against the HOA. She said she had evidence." Dr. Park paused. I asked to see the evidence. She said she didn't have it with her. I asked her to provide it in writing within 5 business days or the allegation would be closed. She said she would. Dr. Park's voice was very dry. "She won't." I had never used school email for anything related to the HOA. Every communication related to our complaint had been sent from my personal accounts, on my personal time, on my personal devices. I had been meticulous about this from the first day, because I was a soldier and I understood the difference between your personal affairs and your institutional standing. Sandra had made a calculation based on a false premise. But I also understood what it meant that she'd gone to my school. She was trying to threaten my job. Not because she had evidence, she didn't, but because the threat of a school investigation, even a false one, was the kind of thing that made people go quiet and go away. She had used this method before. Fiedler, the man whose real name was Dale Hutchins, had confirmed it. His employer had received a similar call 4 years ago. He had left within 8 months. I was not going to leave, but I was now genuinely angry in a way I hadn't been before. Not the cold, functional anger that makes you strategic, but the specific, righteous anger of someone who has just watched an adversary try to take food off her family's table. I let myself feel it for exactly one evening. Then I channeled it into the most precise documentation I had done yet. I prepared an addendum to our Georgia Real Estate Commission complaint that covered Sandra's conduct in the weeks following the initial filing, the false cease and desist, the fabricated emergency governance protocols, the witness intimidation at Nadia Pham's home, the attempt to solicit a false affidavit from Tom Briggs, the calls to community members, and the school visit. 14 pages. Every incident dated, sourced, and cross-referenced. Brenda reviewed it overnight and called me the next morning. "This addendum," she said carefully, "is going to be significant." I asked why. She said, "Because it documents a pattern of retaliation against complainants following the filing of a formal fair housing complaint. That's a separate federal violation, Denise. Retaliation against fair housing complainants is explicitly prohibited under Section 818 of the Fair Housing Act." I sat with that for a moment. "Add it to the file," I said. Sandra's next move was the one I had not seen coming, not because it was clever, but because it was so reckless that I had assumed no one capable of surviving 11 years in a position of community authority would attempt it. I was wrong. She called Glenn's employer not to complain about Glenn, but to suggest that Marcus was under investigation for financial impropriety. Marcus was not. Marcus had never been. There was not a single fact in the universe that could be marshaled in support of this claim. But Sandra had made the call, and word got back to Marcus through a colleague at his firm who happened to know Glenn's managing director. Marcus sat at the kitchen table when he heard this. He was very still. He is a man of deep patience, a quality I had fallen in love with. But there is a line beneath that patience, and I watched Sandra Whitmore's call cross it. He looked at me and said, "She just called my firm." I said I knew. He said, "She lied about me to my professional colleagues with no factual basis." I said yes. He said, "She is going to regret that specifically." Marcus called his own attorney the next morning. Not Brenda, his firm's attorney, who handled defamation and professional misconduct matters. The attorney listened, reviewed what we had, and said, "This is defamation, Parisi. She made a false statement of fact to a third party that damaged his professional reputation. We can file." Marcus said, "File." I sat across from him at the kitchen table while he made that call, and I thought, Sandra Whitmore picked the wrong family. The personal defamation suit was filed in Fulton County Superior Court on a Monday morning. It named Sandra Whitmore individually, separate from the HOA complaint. It sought compensatory and punitive damages. It was served to Sandra at her home by a process server at 9:45 a.m. while she was, according to her neighbor, sitting on her front porch with a cup of coffee. The neighbor did not feel bad about telling us this. By afternoon, Carol had called to tell me that Sandra had convened what Carol described as an unscheduled private conversation with Glenn, meaning she had shown up at his office. Glenn had reportedly told her to leave. This was the first time in Carol's years of watching the Whitmore household that she had heard of Glenn refusing Sandra anything. The equilibrium of that marriage, whatever it was, appeared to be shifting. Tom Briggs called me that evening. He sounded exhausted and, for the first time, almost openly apologetic. He said, "She's calling in favors from people who don't have any more favors to give. I've known Sandra for 8 years and I've never seen her this way." I asked what way. He thought for a moment and said, "Desperate, like she knows the walls are closing and she can't stop them." I said, "She's right about that." He said, "I know. I'm sorry I didn't say that sooner. I want to be honest about something. Hearing Tom say that, and I knew he meant it, did not feel like vindication. Felt like waste. 8 years of watching. 8 years of voting with her, of seconding her motions, of looking at the floor. The apology was real, but it was also late in the way that all late apologies are late. After the damage is done. On Wednesday of that week, Glenn Whitmore called our house. Marcus answered. Glenn said, without preamble, I need to talk to you both. Not as HOA, not as anything official. Just, I need to talk. Marcus said to come over. He came that evening, walking from his house 3 blocks away. He looked like a man carrying something very heavy for a very long time who had just decided he couldn't carry it anymore. Glenn sat at our kitchen table and told us things. He told us that Sandra had been doing variations of what she'd done to us for his entire marriage. That she had driven neighbors out of communities twice before. They had lived in 3 different neighborhoods in 20 years, and in each one a similar pattern had emerged and they had moved on before it became public. He said, I thought this time would be different. I told myself that. He looked at his hands. I don't know what I was waiting for. Glenn told us one more thing that changed everything, that changed the shape of the entire story I'd been living inside. He said, she knew who you were, not just your name. She knew your military record. I said, what? He said, before you moved in, she ran background checks on everyone who bought on this street. She knew you were Army. She knew your deployment record. She wasn't afraid of it. She thought it was irrelevant. He paused. She thought a teacher was easier to move than a lawyer or a businessman. She miscalculated. I sat very still in my kitchen after Glenn said that. The background checks were almost certainly not legal under the Fair Housing Act. Using information from background checks to make housing-related decisions is specifically regulated. But more than the legal implication, I was sitting with the understanding that Sandra had known about my service from the beginning and had still decided I wasn't a threat. The arrogance of that decision. The profound, consequential arrogance of that decision. Glenn stayed for an hour and a half. When he left, he shook Marcus's hand and then turned to me at the door and said, I'm going to give a statement to whoever needs it. I looked at him for a moment. I said, Glenn, you don't have to. He said, I know. That's why I'm going to. He walked home in the dark. Marcus and I watched him go from the porch without saying anything. Glenn's statement was 6 pages, notarized, and submitted to Brenda the following afternoon. It contained the information about the background checks, the prior neighborhoods, and Sandra's awareness of my military record. Brenda read it and said on the phone, with a long pause between sentences, this is everything. I said I thought so too. The background check information, combined with what we already had, was forwarded to Colonel Weatherford the same day. Weatherford called me 20 minutes after receiving it. He said, I need you to listen carefully. What Glenn is describing, using background check information as a basis for HOA enforcement decisions, has specific legal implications that I want our team to review before we discuss further. Can you be in Atlanta Thursday morning? I said yes. I drove to Atlanta Thursday morning. The Attorney General's office is a calm, institutional place. Fluorescent lights, gray carpets, the specific quiet of people doing serious work without performing it. Colonel Weatherford met me in a conference room with 2 other people. An assistant AG named Kim Saunders and a housing law specialist named David Cho. They had a copy of every document I had submitted. They had read all of it. Kim Saunders said, Mrs. Caldwell, what you've brought us is remarkable in its organization and its evidentiary completeness. I want to be clear about what we believe this file contains. It contains sufficient documentation to support a civil enforcement action under the Georgia Fair Housing Act and potentially under the Federal Fair Housing Act. We intend to open a formal inquiry. I said, thank you. I meant it simply, not dramatically. It was the right outcome, and I was glad. David Cho then said something that I had not expected. We also want to discuss the background checks, the specific use of background check data in the manner Glenn Whitmore describes, if documented, may constitute a pattern and practice violation that could support a separate action against the HOA as an entity and Sandra Whitmore as an individual. He pushed a one-page summary across the table. I read it. The implications were significant. The HOA itself, as a legal entity, could face formal state action. I drove home from Atlanta in the early afternoon. The Georgia highway was flat and green and familiar. I thought about Amara's jellyfish poster on the refrigerator. I thought about my recycling bin being 6 inches from the curb. I thought about 11 months of documented incidents and a woman who had looked at my military record and decided I was manageable. I thought, I have done everything right, and it is going to matter. When I got home, Amara was at the kitchen table doing homework. She looked up. How did it go? She asked. I said, good. Really good. She studied me for a moment with those serious eyes that look exactly like my mother's and said, did you win? I said, we're getting there. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her work. That Thursday evening, Sandra made what I believe was her final, most reckless move. She filed a complaint with the Georgia Professional Standards Commission, the body that oversees teacher certification in Georgia, alleging that I had engaged in conduct unbecoming a public school educator by organizing politically motivated campaigns using school resources. The same fabricated allegation she had brought to Dr. Park, now filed formally. The Professional Standards Commission complaint was different from the school visit. It had actual procedural weight. A formal complaint required a formal response and could, if handled badly, create a record that affected my license. Sandra knew exactly what she was doing. She had looked up the process. She had filed it correctly. This was not desperation. This was calculated cruelty by someone who understood, finally, that she was going to lose the HOA fight and had decided to take something else from me instead. Dr. Park called me within an hour of the PSC notification. She said, I know. I've already contacted the district's legal team. I want you to know that the district is going to stand behind you. I thanked her. I said, Linda, she's going to claim school resources were used. Every communication I sent was from personal accounts on personal time. I can prove it. Dr. Park said, I know you can. That's why she's going to lose this one too. I called Brenda next. Brenda listened and then said, very quietly, she just committed an act of retaliation against a fair housing complainant using a state professional licensing system. That is, Denise, I want to be careful here. That is potentially criminal. I said, I know. Brenda said, Colonel Weatherford needs to see this tonight. I said, he will. I sent the PSC complaint to Weatherford at 9 p.m. He acknowledged receipt at 9:17 p.m. with 2 words, got it. I turned off my laptop, took a shower, and went to bed. I slept 7 hours, the most I'd slept in 3 weeks. Marcus sat with me on the back porch the next morning before Amara woke up. The Georgia morning was soft and humid. Birds in the oak tree at the back of the yard, Scout circling our chairs. Marcus said, she's trying to take your license, Denver. I said I knew. He said, why? She's already losing everything else. I thought about it. I said, because she can't accept that she's losing to me. She needs to take something. It's not strategy anymore. It's personal. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said, that's when people make the mistakes that can't be taken back. He looked at his coffee. I looked at my coffee. We sat there listening to the birds for a while. Neither of us needed to say anything else. I want to note something about this period that I think is important to say clearly. My students didn't know any of this was happening. 7th grade is hard enough without your history teacher being in a legal battle. I walked into Jefferson Middle School every day and I taught Reconstruction era, the Progressive Era, World War I. I was present. I was patient. I was, if anything, more deliberate and intentional in those classes because standing in front of 28 12-year-olds and teaching them about people who had fought for things that were right reminded me every single day why it mattered to keep going. One of my students, a girl named Maya whose grandmother had marched in Selma in 1965, stopped me after class one afternoon and said, "Ms. Caldwell, you seem like something important is happening to you." I looked at her. I said, "Something is, but it's being handled." She nodded with the gravity of a 12-year-old who has been told important things by important women her whole life. Then she said, "Good. You're good at handling things." I thanked her. I carried that through the rest of the week. The PSC complaint required a formal response within 30 days. I prepared it over a weekend. A 12-page documented rebuttal with communication logs, device records, and sworn statements from Dr. Park, the district's IT department, and 3 colleagues confirming that all HOA-related communications had been made from personal accounts and personal devices. Not one school resource had been used. The documentation was exhaustive and, frankly, overkill, but I had learned that with Sandra Whitmore there was no such thing as overkill. Brenda filed the rebuttal with an addendum, a formal allegation that the PSC complaint constituted unlawful retaliation under the Fair Housing Act, and a request that the Commission note the timing and context of the filing. She sent copies to the Georgia Attorney General's office and to the HUD investigator who had been assigned to our federal complaint. We were drawing every relevant body into the same gravitational field. The HOA's insurance carrier scheduled their review meeting for the 3rd Friday in the month. Brenda attended as our representative. She described it to me afterward in a single sentence. The underwriter sat across from Sandra and her attorney for 45 minutes, and then told them that the carrier was reviewing whether the HOA's conduct fell within the policy's coverage exclusions for intentional discriminatory acts. Sandra's attorney had asked for a recess. They had taken 20 minutes. When they came back, the attorney had asked about settlement. The underwriter had said that was a conversation for the parties. It was settlement talk. For the first time, the word settlement had entered the room. I told Marcus that evening. He looked at me steadily and said, "Only if the terms are real." I said, "Agreed." We both knew what real terms looked like. They were not going to be small, and they were not going to be quiet. The settlement conversation lasted 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, Sandra did not call me, did not contact me, did not send notices, did not appear at my door. The silence was the loudest thing I had heard in 18 months. It was the silence of someone who has finally run out of moves and is waiting to see what happens next. Brenda led the negotiation. She was precise and patient and absolutely unmovable on the core terms. A formal finding of discriminatory enforcement practices. A public acknowledgement to the community. Personal financial accountability from Sandra Whitmore, not just the HOA, and structural reforms to the board's governance that would prevent the same thing from happening again. Sandra's attorney kept trying to trade one thing for another. Brenda would not trade. Yvette and I had agreed before the negotiations began. We were not accepting a settlement that allowed Sandra to remain on the board. Whatever else was in the document, that was non-negotiable. Not because we wanted to punish her, or not only because of that, but because the board's dysfunction was inseparable from her presence in it, and structural change without her removal was not structural change at all. During the 2 weeks of settlement talks, the Georgia Real Estate Commission completed its preliminary review. A GRC investigator had conducted interviews with all complainants, all board members, and several current and former residents. The investigator's preliminary finding, which Carol forwarded to me after receiving it as a board member, was that there was probable cause to believe discriminatory enforcement practices had occurred within the Maplewood Commons HOA, probable cause. 2 words with legal weight. The commission would now proceed to formal adjudication unless the matter was resolved through a consent agreement. Sandra's attorney received the same letter on the same day. Brenda said the investigator's timeline had accelerated because of the volume and quality of our documentation. They don't usually move this fast, she said. They moved this fast because you gave them everything they needed already. The HUD investigation was still ongoing. Federal timelines were slower, but the HUD investigator had called Brenda twice in the preceding week to request additional documentation, which is the kind of thing investigators do when they are building towards something rather than waiting for it to resolve itself. Brenda said this was a good sign. I filed it accordingly. Marcus's defamation suit was proceeding separately. Sandra's personal attorney had requested a discovery extension, which Marcus's attorney had opposed. The court had given Sandra 30 days to produce documents related to the Buckhead call. Marcus was calm about it. He'd been a lawyer long enough to understand the timeline of litigation. He was patient. He would wait. Tom Briggs called me one afternoon during the settlement period. He had something specific to say. I want you to know that if this goes to any formal hearing, I'm willing to testify about everything, including things that happened before you moved in. I said, Tom, I appreciate that. I want to ask you something. The Washingtons, the family on Elm Street from 2021. Do you know how to reach them? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think so. Let me make some calls. He did. He found them. I forwarded their contact information to Brenda. The Washingtons, Michael and Gina, had moved to Savannah. They had not known about the complaint. When Brenda called them, Gina Washington cried. She said, we thought it was just us. We thought there was something wrong with us, with our house, with the way we handled things. There was not. There had never been anything wrong with them. They were willing to provide a statement. They provided 3. Something was building. I could feel it the way I used to feel the forward movement of an operation that had been meticulously planned and was now executing correctly. A sense not of certainty, because nothing in life is certain but of alignment. Everything I had done, every document I had kept, every decision I had made to stay calm and stay strategic and stay, all of it was converging toward a moment that was coming whether Sandra Whitmore was ready for it or not. 2 days before the settlement deadline, something happened that none of us had anticipated. Glenn filed for divorce. He filed in Fulton County. He filed for divorce from Sandra Whitmore after 27 years of marriage, in the middle of a fair housing investigation, a defamation suit, a Georgia Real Estate Commission proceeding, a federal HUD investigation, and a Professional Standards Commission complaint that Sandra had filed against me. I found out because Carol called me. I was quiet for a long moment. I want to be honest about what I felt when I heard that. It was not triumph. It was not satisfaction. It was something more complicated, something closer to the feeling you get when you understand that the damage a person does to others almost always reflects the damage they do to the people closest to them, that the same control and cruelty I had been facing for 18 months had almost certainly been present in that house for 27 years. Glenn Whitmore was not a sympathetic figure to me, but he was also, I realized, someone who had been living in the shadow of the same person I had been fighting. The difference was he'd had no choice about being in it. Sandra's attorney called Brenda the morning Glenn filed and asked for a 48-hour extension on the settlement deadline. Brenda said no. She said the situation was well documented enough that the GRC and HUD would proceed on their own timelines regardless of what happened in the civil settlement, and that our clients had already extended considerable patience. The deadline held. On the day of the settlement deadline, I took the afternoon off school. A personal day, the first I had taken all year. I sat at home with Marcus and Scout and waited for Brenda to call. She called at 4:17 p.m. and said, she agreed to all of it. I said, All of it, Brenda said. All of it. All of it meant a formal consent agreement with the Georgia Real Estate Commission acknowledging discriminatory enforcement practices, a mandatory community notification letter, signed by the HOA board, to be sent to all Maplewood Commons residents, a financial settlement that included restitution to the 8 affected households, a fine paid to a fair housing fund, and the legal costs of the complainants. Structural reforms including independent oversight of enforcement decisions and a mandatory fair housing training program for all board members and future board candidates. And Sandra Whitmore's immediate resignation from the HOA board and prohibition from seeking or holding any officer position in the Maplewood Commons HOA for a period of 10 years. I sat with those terms for about 60 seconds. I thought about the morning in my driveway after the November board meeting when I had told Marcus I had it handled. I thought about my recycling bin 6 inches from the curb. I thought about Amara's jellyfish on the refrigerator and the Gullah Geechee heritage poster and Scout asleep under the kitchen table. I said to Marcus, "She agreed." He said, "She had no choice." Then he hugged me, long and quiet, and neither of us needed to say anything else. Brenda filed the consent agreement with the GRC that same afternoon. It would take several days for the formal process to complete, but the agreement was binding. Sandra had signed it personally, alongside the HOA's remaining board members. The signature was reportedly produced by a woman who looked, according to her own attorney, like someone who had been awake for 4 days. The community notification letter went out to Maplewood Commons residents the following Tuesday, sent through the HOA's official channels, signed by the full board, and mailed as a certified letter to each household. I read my copy at the kitchen table with Amara eating cereal across from me. She watched me read it. When I put it down, she said, "Did it say what you wanted?" I said, "It said what was true." She considered that. Then she said, "Same thing." She was right. The community notification letter was the document Sandra had fought hardest against. She had argued, through her attorney, for language that was forward-looking rather than focused on past conduct. She had argued for a version that acknowledged communication challenges rather than discriminatory enforcement. Brenda had rejected every version. The letter that went out was direct, factual, and specific. It named the practices. It acknowledged what had happened. The response to the letter within the community was immediate and electric. By Wednesday afternoon, the Maplewood Commons neighborhood app had over 500 comments. By Thursday, the letter had been photographed and shared publicly on social media. Not by us, but by a resident we'd never spoken to who simply felt the community deserved to know. By Friday, Gail Tran had her follow-up story. Gail's follow-up ran in the Maplewood Courier on Saturday. It ran on the front page. The headline, which Gail showed me before publication to make sure the facts were accurate, read, "HOA President resigns following discrimination finding. Consent agreement requires reforms." Beneath it, a photograph of the Maplewood Commons entrance sign, with its wrought iron letters spelling out the name of the place I had fought to stay in. I read the article at my kitchen table while Marcus made pancakes and Amara walked Scout around the block. The article was thorough and accurate. It named Sandra. It described the 11-year tenure. It included the consent agreement terms. It quoted a vet who said, "We moved here because we believed in this community. We stayed and fought because we still do." It quoted me, "The point was never to punish anyone. The point was to make this place what it said it was." What I had not expected, what none of us had quite prepared for, was the scope of what happened next in the community itself. The consent agreement and the letter had functioned like a valve being released on a pressure system that had been building for years. People I had never met came to my door. People called. People texted through mutual contacts. Not just current residents, former residents who had moved out, people who had left believing the problem was them. A woman named Patricia Leary, who had lived on Birchwood Lane 4 years ago and moved to Decatur after 18 months of relentless notices, appeared at my door on Saturday morning. She had driven 40 minutes. She said, "I just needed to say thank you in person." I invited her in. She sat in my kitchen and drank coffee and told her story. The same pattern, the same escalation, the same grinding quality of being made to feel wrong in your own home. She had assumed no one else had experienced it. She had assumed she had failed somehow. She had been wrong. Knowing that, she said, was the only thing she'd wanted. The next 2 weeks brought more Patricius. More people who had been driven out and had quietly absorbed the damage and moved on. Each one was a thread that extended the documented pattern backward in time. Back before our complaint, back before the 2019 email, back to the early years of Sandra's tenure when she had first discovered that most people, when ground down long enough, eventually leave. Most people, not all. Gail Tran wrote 2 more follow-up pieces. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran a full feature. The story was picked up by a housing rights advocacy newsletter that went to 12,000 subscribers. The Georgia Fair Housing Coalition cited our case in a policy brief on selective HOA enforcement. Brenda was invited to speak on a panel at a Georgia Bar Association housing law conference. She sent me a text after the invitation. "You built this case. I just filed it." I sent back, "We both know that's not the whole truth." She replied with a laughing emoji and then, "Team effort. That was exactly right." In the weeks following the settlement, the HOA board, now minus Sandra, with Carol Austin stepping up as interim chair and Dave Huang taking a more active role, began the structural reforms the consent agreement required. An independent enforcement review panel was established, made up of a rotating group of residents, not board members. All enforcement decisions would go through the panel before being sent. All decisions would be documented with explicit criteria. The first decision the new panel reviewed was, ironically, a notice that had been queued up against a property on Elm Street, the same street where the Washingtons had lived. The notice was for a garden ornament. The panel reviewed it against the criteria, found it unsubstantiated, and declined to send it. Carol called me to report this, sounding, for the first time in months, genuinely light. The PSC complaint against my teaching license was dismissed 36 days after we filed our rebuttal. The Professional Standards Commission's letter said the complaint lacked evidentiary support and had been filed without factual basis. It specifically noted that all communications reviewed confirmed no school resources had been used. The district's equity director sent me a copy of the dismissal with a handwritten note. "Well done. Keep teaching. TM." I framed that note. Not the dismissal, the note. I put it on my desk at school, next to a photograph of my unit from 2009. Teaching and service. 2 things that had defined me long before Sandra Whitmore knew my name. Marcus's defamation suit proceeded. Sandra's attorney had requested mediation. Marcus's attorney had agreed with conditions. The mediation was scheduled for 6 weeks out. We did not discuss the terms we would accept because we had not yet decided what we wanted, whether we wanted money, or whether we wanted a formal record, or whether we wanted both. We had time. The legal system, when it is working for you, affords patience in a way it does not always afford to people it works against. I was aware of this. Glenn Whitmore's divorce proceedings were separate and private and not my business. I will say only that 3 weeks after filing, he reached out to Marcus to express that he intended to cooperate fully with any ongoing investigation, that he had retained his own attorney, and that he was, in his words, done protecting things that don't deserve protecting. Marcus relayed this to Brenda. She added it to the file. The HUD investigation continued on its own timeline, which is federal time, slow, thorough, and with consequences proportionate to the finding. Brenda estimated it would take another 6 to 8 months. We had filed everything they needed. We did not follow up weekly. We trusted the process because we had built it correctly. The foundation does not shift because you stop watching it. And then came the public meeting. Not a board meeting, not a town hall. A community meeting organized by residents for residents to discuss what had happened and where Maplewood Commons went from here. It was held on a Saturday morning in early fall, in the same clubhouse where Sandra had grabbed my arm 4 months earlier. 51 residents came, more than had ever come to an HOA meeting in Carol's memory. I was not the main event at that meeting. I want to say that clearly. I was one voice among many. Yvette spoke. Carol spoke. Nadia Pham spoke. Gerald Webb spoke. Patricia Leary had driven back from Decatur and spoke. Tom Briggs stood up and, with visible difficulty, gave the only public apology I heard during this entire process from someone who had enabled what Sandra did. I looked the other way for years. That's on me. I'm going to spend the next however many years on this board trying to make that right. He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then people clapped. Not enthusiastically, thoughtfully. The kind of clap that means we hear you and we're watching. When I spoke, I said something I had been thinking about for months. This community was always capable of being what it said it was. It just needed people to insist on it. That was all. I sat down. Amara, who had come with Marcus and was sitting in the back row, gave me a thumbs up. I gave her one back. That exchange was the best moment of the entire day. After the meeting, as people filtered out into the fall morning, a man I didn't recognize came up to me. He was in his 70s, white-haired, with the careful posture of someone who had lived in his body for a long time and taken care of it. He said, "I've lived here for 20 years. I knew something was wrong. I never said anything." I looked at him. He said, "I wanted to say that. I don't have an excuse. I just wanted to say it." I thanked him. He nodded and walked away. I watched him go and I thought, that's where change lives. Not in the dramatic moments, in the small, honest ones. The question I was asked most often by neighbors, by Gail Tran, by people at the housing law conference where Brenda spoke, by friends who had followed the story, was some version of, how did you stay so calm? How did you not break? How did you keep going when it would have been so much easier to just sell the house and leave? The honest answer has 2 parts. The first part is the Army. 14 years of service teaches you to distinguish between situations that require immediate emotional response and situations that require sustained, disciplined action. Sandra Whitmore was never an immediate emergency. She was a sustained problem. Sustained problems require sustained responses. You don't run at them. You work them. The second part is simpler. I didn't leave because leaving would have meant teaching my daughter that when someone tries to take something from you that is rightfully yours, your home, your dignity, your standing in your own community, the right response is to yield. I could not teach her that. Not with everything I knew about what it costs to yield, and everything I knew about what it costs to stay. Amara and I had a conversation the week after the settlement was announced. She had questions, real ones, not the soft questions adults sometimes deflect by calling them too complicated. She asked, "Did the lady get punished enough?" I thought about it. I said, "She lost her position. She's facing legal consequences. Her reputation is a matter of public record now." Amara said, "But she's not in jail." I said, "No." She thought about that. Then, "Is that fair?" I said, "It's what the law provides. Fairness and law aren't always exactly the same thing. The work is to keep making them closer together." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she wrote something in her notebook. I didn't ask what. The formal GRC consent agreement was made public 3 weeks after signing. As a matter of administrative record, It was posted to the Georgia Real Estate Commission's public complaint database. Anyone who searched Sandra Whitmore's name would find it. Anyone who searched Maplewood Commons HOA would find it. It would be there for years. That is, in its own way, a form of permanence. The community notification letter had specifically included, at Brenda's insistence and over Sandra's attorney's strenuous objection, a sentence that read, "The board acknowledges that residents of Maplewood Commons have the right to peaceful enjoyment of their homes free from discriminatory interference, and that past enforcement practices fell short of this standard." That sentence was 3 years of documentation. That sentence was all those notices in a drawer. That sentence was Amara's heritage poster. On the day the consent agreement became public record, Sandra Whitmore closed her Facebook account. I know this because 3 neighbors mentioned it. I noted it the way I noted everything, factually, without celebration. It was information. What it meant was that she understood the public record was now her record, and there was no social media statement that could contextualize it away. 2 weeks after the GRC filing, the county school board formally published a statement confirming that Sandra Whitmore had been removed from the community advisory panel and was ineligible to serve in any advisory capacity to the district for a period of 5 years. The statement cited conduct incompatible with the district's commitment to equity and inclusive community engagement. It was sent to all district parents. A copy was placed in Sandra's file. Files once opened don't close. The Chamber of Commerce Board, where Sandra had also served, accepted her resignation the same week she submitted it. The chamber president issued a brief statement noting the resignation with regret and wishing her well. The brevity of the statement said more than any elaboration would have. And then came the thing I had not expected, the thing that arrived not as a dramatic revelation but as a quiet, personal moment that hit harder than any of the public outcomes. Gail Tran called me on a Thursday afternoon and said, "I received a phone call this morning that I wanted to tell you about, from Roberta Fiedler." I said, "Who?" Gail said, "Dale Hutchins's wife. She uses her maiden name." I said, "What did she say?" Gail was quiet for a moment. Then, she said that her husband, when they left Maplewood Commons 4 years ago, stopped sleeping. Woke up at 3 a.m. convinced something was wrong with him, that they'd failed, that they should have fought. She said after the article ran, he slept through the night for the first time in 4 years. I was quiet. Gail said, "I thought you should know." I was sitting in my car in the school parking lot when Gail told me that. I sat there for a long time after the call ended. The engine off. The afternoon heat settling on the windshield. I thought about Dale Hutchins not sleeping for 4 years. I thought about Nadia Phams shaking hands. I thought about Gina Washington crying on the phone when Brenda called. I thought about what it costs at the cellular level to be made to feel wrong in a place that should be safe. And I sat with that weight for a while because it deserved to be sat with. Then I got out of the car, walked back into Jefferson Middle School, and taught my last class of the day. We were on the civil rights movement. We were on the part about sit-ins, about the discipline and preparation required, about how the students who sat at lunch counters in Greensboro had been trained not to respond to provocation, not to flinch, to hold their position. I did not make the parallel explicit. I didn't need to. They were 12. They were paying attention. They understood things. Sandra's personal legal situation, separate from the HOA, continued to develop. The defamation suit settled out of court before the mediation date. The terms are confidential. I will say only that Marcus called me from his office when it was done and said, "Done." I said, "Good." He said, "The terms are real." I said, "I know they would be." He said, "I love you." I said, "I love you back." That was the whole conversation. It was enough. The Professional Standards Commission closed its file on Sandra's complaint against me with a formal notation that the complaint had been submitted without evidentiary basis. Brenda filed a request that this finding be forwarded to the GRC and to HUD as additional evidence of retaliatory conduct. Both bodies acknowledged receipt. Brenda received a letter from HUD's Atlanta regional office indicating that the federal investigation had broadened to include Sandra's conduct following the initial complaint filing, specifically the PSC complaint, the school visit, and the witness intimidation. The letter indicated that HUD was consulting with the Department of Justice's Housing and Civil Enforcement section. Brenda called me after reading it and said, simply, "Denise, DOJ." I said, "I heard you." She said, "This went national." I said, "Good. I want to be clear about something. I did not set out to end Sandra Whitmore's civic life. I set out to live in my house in peace and have my daughter grow up in a neighborhood where she was treated as what she was, a resident, a child, a person with full and equal standing. The consequences Sandra faced were the consequences of what Sandra had done, compounded over years, to multiple families, documented completely, and brought into the light. I was not her judge. I was her record keeper. The fall semester at Jefferson Middle School was the best teaching semester I had had in 3 years. Not because the HOA situation was resolved or resolving, but because I walked into that building every morning having demonstrated to myself and to my daughter that it was possible to hold your ground without losing yourself. That clarity settled something in me. I was lighter. I was present. My students noticed. Several of them said so. One afternoon in October, Maya, the girl whose grandmother had marched in Selma, came to my room after school. She said, "Ms. Caldwell, I looked up what happened with your HOA." I raised an eyebrow. She said, "My mom showed me the article." She was quiet for a moment. "You're like the people we study." I said, "Maya, I'm just a person who kept good records." She smiled. She said, "That's what all the people we study say." She went home. I sat with that for a long time. In November, the HOA held its annual board election. For the first time in 11 years, Sandra Whitmore's name was not on the ballot. Under the terms of the consent agreement, she was prohibited from standing. 3 new residents ran for open seats. All 3 had attended the fall community meeting. One was Nadia Pham's daughter, a 29-year-old urban planner named Lily who had watched her mother shaking on the phone with me and decided she was going to be involved going forward. Lily won by the largest margin of any candidate. The board that emerged from that election, Carol as chair, Dave Huang, Tom Briggs continuing his redemption in visible and documented ways, Lily Pham, and a retired civil rights attorney named James Okafor, who had lived quietly on the far side of the neighborhood for 6 years and now decided he had something to contribute, was a board that looked like Maplewood Commons actually looked. Not like one person's idea of what it should look like. The first formal board meeting of the new term was open to residents. Yvette and I attended. We sat in the same front row where we had sat for months of meetings, presenting documentation, asking procedural questions, being tabled and ignored and overruled. We sat there now in a meeting where the board looked at us not with hostility or calculation but with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of people doing shared work. It was an ordinary meeting. It was the most satisfying meeting I had ever attended. After that meeting in the parking lot, Yvette and I stood next to her car and didn't say much. It was a cool November evening. The subdivision entrance sign was lit by ground lights that one of the residents had had repaired. It looked exactly as it had when I'd first driven through it 2.5 years ago, thinking, this is a good place. We'd made it true. Marcus and I made a decision in November. We were not moving. We had discussed it during the hardest parts of the fight as a contingency. If this goes badly, if the school situation escalates, if it becomes untenable. We had been willing to consider it. We were not willing to accept it. The house at 14 Birchwood Lane was our home. It was Amara's home. Scout had a dog door in the back and a perfect patch of sun in the afternoon and a beagle's certainty that he was exactly where he should be. We were staying. The final accounting of Sandra Whitmore's tenure at Maplewood Commons. 11 years as HOA president. 3 communities prior, in which a similar pattern had played out without documentation or consequence. A GRC consent agreement that was a matter of public record. A federal HUD investigation that, as of the fall, remained open. A defamation suit settled on terms that were real. Removal from 2 advisory boards and ineligibility for a 3rd. A PSC complaint dismissed as baseless. A marriage of 27 years. Ended. I don't know what Sandra Whitmore's life looked like after all of this. I know she retained a home in Maplewood Commons. She had not moved. I know from Carol that she appeared occasionally at community events and was treated by most residents with a kind of cool, formal neutrality, not hostility, not warmth. The invisible but precisely calibrated distance of people who know what you are and have decided not to pretend otherwise. I thought, that is probably the consequence that matters most to someone like Sandra. Not the legal outcomes. The look on the faces of people who used to be her allies. Glenn Whitmore filed his divorce documentation in November. He remained in the house temporarily while the legal process continued. He had, according to Carol, become active in a housing equity nonprofit in Atlanta, something he had apparently been interested in before his marriage and had quietly put aside. I found this out secondhand and I thought, people are complicated. Even the people adjacent to the damage. Renee Castillo resigned from the HOA board the week after the election and did not seek reappointment. She sent me a brief handwritten note, not email, a note like Carol's note from the equity director, the kind of gesture that means something precisely because it costs effort, that said, I should have spoken sooner. I am glad you didn't need me to. I wrote back. I said, you spoke when it mattered. Thank you. I meant it. Grace in situations like this is not weakness. It is accuracy. Tom Briggs ran for re-election and won, narrowly because the community remembered, but he had spent a year demonstrating that remembering could lead to something other than repeating. He has voted, in every meeting since, with transparency and caution. He will never be the person he could have been if he'd spoken 11 years ago. But he is, in the present tense, a person trying to be better. I respect that. It is not nothing. Our restitution from the HOA settlement was deposited in November. We had already decided what to do with our portion. A portion to Amara's college fund, and a portion to the Georgia Fair Housing Coalition, earmarked for the pro bono legal fund that helps families who don't have a Marcus or a Brenda or a Colonel Weatherford. Families who face the same fight with fewer resources and need the same outcome. Brenda said this was the most satisfying disbursement she had supervised in her career. I said I wasn't surprised. She said, no, you wouldn't be. Amara made a school project in December, the last one of the semester, for her social studies class, on the topic of her choice. She chose housing discrimination in America. She interviewed Yvette. She interviewed Nadia Pham. She interviewed on the phone Gina Washington, who had driven past their old Elm Street house on the way to a visit and had stopped the car and just sat there for a while. Amara made a poster. She used primary sources. Her teacher gave her an A and wrote on the rubric, exceptional personal research, clearly came from someone close to the subject. Amara asked me the night before she turned in the project if she could hang it in our front window. I said yes. No notice came. I waited 3 days to be sure. No notice. I looked at that poster, bioluminescent in its own right, yellow and precise and made by my 11-year-old who had watched her mother fight for this house and this street, and I thought, there it is. There is the whole thing. In a window on a street, in a home that is ours. We had a small gathering at the house in December. Yvette and Terrence, Carol, Dave Huang and his wife Lily Pham, Brenda and Marcus's old colleague from the church, the deacon who had told Sandra there was nothing concerning about our family. We had wine and Marcus's ribs and Amara's scrambled eggs and Scout circling everyone's ankles looking for dropped food. It was not a celebration of winning. It was something quieter. A gathering of people who had been through something real together and were now on the other side of it. In a warm house, on a December evening, in a neighborhood that was still imperfect and still ours. That was enough. It was more than enough. I teach my students every year about the difference between history as dates and facts and history as the accumulated weight of ordinary people making decisions, to speak or stay silent, to document or let slide, to stay or leave. This year I teach it differently. I teach it the way you teach something you've lived. I don't tell them that. I don't need to. They can hear it in the way I say the words, and they lean forward in their seats and they listen, and I think, this is the work. This is why it mattered. This is what we stayed for. Maplewood Commons held its first ever community cleanup day in the spring, organized not by the board but by residents, including families who had never participated in a community event before. Nadia Pham brought her famous spring rolls. Yvette organized the logistics. Marcus and Terrence Robinson cleared a section of drainage ditch behind the park that had been neglected for years. Amara and Lily Pham's younger sister collected trash along Birchwood Lane and made it a race, which Amara won, because Amara wins most things she decides to win. I planted flowers that spring, tulips specifically, the same kind I had planted in my first month in this house that had triggered a notice for unregistered landscaping modifications. I planted them in the front yard where everyone could see them. Yellow ones, Amara's color. Nobody said a word. There is a question I have asked myself many times in the months since the settlement, since the consent agreement, since the school notice was dismissed and the advisory panels rescinded their appointments and the community letter went out to every mailbox in Maplewood Commons. Was it worth it? The sleepless nights, the documentation, the calculated patience, the weight I carried for 18 months, the fear I never showed Amara. Was it worth it? I think about Dale Hutchins sleeping through the night. I think about Gina Washington crying on the phone. I think about Nadia Pham reading from her list at the town hall, hands steady after 4 years of being made to feel wrong. I think about Lily Pham winning a seat on the board. I think about Amara's heritage poster in the front window, unremarkable now, just another part of a home. I think about my daughter in December, interviewing Yvette on the phone for a school project, asking, "How did you know you would win?" And Yvette saying, "We didn't. We just knew we weren't going to stop." Yes, it was worth it. It did not make everything right. It did not undo the nights the Washingtons couldn't sleep, or the 4 years Dale Hutchins woke up at 3 a.m. wondering what was wrong with him. It did not refund the exhaustion, the legal fees, the meetings, the certified letters, the accumulated cost of having to prove repeatedly that you belonged somewhere you had earned and paid for and deserved. Justice is not erasure. It is accountability, and accountability is the beginning of repair, not its end. But it was a beginning, and beginnings matter. They matter specifically in the way that only things that almost didn't happen can matter. We were so close at so many points to having this simply not work. If I had not kept the log, if Carol had not kept the minutes, if Dave had not slid that piece of paper across the table, if Tom's mother had not called on a Saturday morning from a phone number I didn't recognize, if Glenn had not come to our door on a Wednesday evening carrying 27 years of something he needed to put down. Every one of those moments was a choice by a person who decided in that moment to do the harder right thing instead of the easier wrong thing. That is what we studied in 7th grade history, and it is also what happened on my street in Maplewood Commons, Georgia, in a neighborhood no one outside of it had ever heard of, over 18 months that I will carry for the rest of my life. I am a teacher. I am a veteran. I am a wife and a mother and a homeowner and a neighbor. I am someone who planted tulips and kept a log and did not look away. These things are not in conflict. They were always the same thing, expressed differently in different rooms. The refusal to accept that the world as it is cannot become, through sustained and documented and collective effort, closer to the world as it should be. My name is Denise Caldwell. I live at 14 Birchwood Lane, Maplewood Commons Subdivision, Georgia. I have lived here for 3 years now. My daughter makes perfect scrambled eggs and drew a jellyfish on the refrigerator door in October that I still haven't taken down. My beagle's name is Scout, and he has a patch of afternoon sun in the kitchen that he has established as irrevocably his. My husband, Marcus, makes coffee too strong and is right about almost everything and is the best decision I have made. We are not leaving. Sandra Whitmore has not knocked on my door. She has not written to me. She has not, as far as I know, said my name in any public context since the settlement. I have seen her once, at the mailbox, on a cold morning in January. She looked at me and I looked at her. Nothing was said. Everything was already said. I picked up my mail and went inside. Every year in my classroom, I ask my students a question on the first day. What does it mean to be a citizen? And every year, different students give different answers: voting, paying taxes, following laws, participating in community, serving your country. I tell them all of those things are part of it. I tell them citizenship is also this: noticing what is wrong, documenting it carefully, finding others who see it too, and persisting through every obstacle and every tactic of delay and every attempt to make you doubt yourself and your records and your right to be exactly where you are. That is citizenship. I know it precisely. I have lived it. After the spring cleanup day, as the neighbors dispersed and Amara and Lily Pham's sister were tallying their trash collection totals in fierce competition, I stood on the sidewalk in front of my house for a moment. The tulips were blooming along the front walk, yellow mostly, with a few red ones Amara had insisted on. The neighborhood was quiet in the specific way of a Saturday afternoon after something communal has happened and people are heading back to their ordinary lives, which is actually what you want. You want ordinary. Ordinary means home. Marcus came up beside me. He put his arm around my shoulders. He said, "You know what I think every time I pull into this driveway?" I said, "What?" He said, "That we picked the right house." I laughed. It was the real kind, unexpected, brief, from somewhere deep. I said, "We made it the right house." He said, "Yeah, you did." I said, "We did." He was quiet. Then, "Yeah, we did." We stood there for a while. Scout came out the front door, which Amara had left open, and sat on the top step and looked at us with the specific expression of a beagle who cannot understand why the two people he loves are just standing on the sidewalk not doing anything useful. We went inside. In May, I received a letter, not email, a letter from Roberta Fiedler, Dale's wife, the one Gail had told me about. It was 2 paragraphs. The first said that Dale was doing well, that he had started gardening again, which was something he'd stopped doing after they left Maplewood Commons and never quite resumed. The second paragraph said, "He told me to tell you that when we drove away from that house, he looked in the rearview mirror and felt like he was leaving something that was wrong. He was right. He wanted you to know that you got it back. Not for us, but for everyone who comes after. That matters." I folded the letter and put it in the file, right at the front. I tell the story not because it ended well, though it did, but because it almost didn't, and because the reason it ended well was not luck or drama or a single moment of cinematic confrontation. The reason it ended well was documentation, persistence, community, and the specific, trained discipline of a woman who had been taught, in a desert 8,000 miles away, to hold her position and trust her preparation and wait for the right moment. Those skills saved my career once. They saved my home. In June, 2 years to the month from the night Sandra grabbed my arm in the Maplewood Commons clubhouse, I attended a HOA board meeting. It was the regular monthly meeting, budgetary items, landscaping contract renewal, pool schedule. Utterly ordinary. I sat in the back row this time, not the front. Not because I was backing down, but because the front row is for people who need to be seen. I no longer needed to be seen. I just needed to be there. And I was. After the meeting, Lily Pham caught up with me in the parking lot. She was 29 and precise and had her mother's eyes and a sharpness that would serve this community well for a long time. She said, "My mom wanted me to give you something." She handed me a small box. Inside was a pair of wind chimes. Delicate metal, exactly the kind Amara had hung on our back porch in our first month here. The ones that had earned us a notice for a violation that wasn't one. I held them in my hands. Lily said, "She made them. She wanted you to hang them wherever you wanted." I said, "Tell her I will." I said it to Lily. But I was also saying it to Sandra Whitmore and 11 years of invented rules and 6-inch margins and laminated guidelines and letters that tried to tell us we didn't belong here. I said it to all of it. I will. I hung the wind chimes on the back porch that evening. Amara heard them from her room and came downstairs and stood in the doorway looking at them turning in the June breeze. She said, "They sound nice." I said, "They do." She said, "We're keeping those, right?" I said, "We're keeping those." She went back upstairs. I stood on the porch a moment longer, listening to them in my house, in my backyard, in my neighborhood, on my street, where the tulips had bloomed and the beagle had his sun patch and my daughter had won the trash collection race and my husband made the coffee too strong and everything was exactly, imperfectly, stubbornly ours. I thought about something Colonel Weatherford had said to me the day I left Fort Benning for the last time, when I was separating from service after 14 years. He had said, "Caldwell, the mission doesn't end when you leave. You take it with you into whatever comes next." I had not known then what that would mean in a practical sense. I know now. It meant keeping the log. It meant sitting in the front row. It meant saying very quietly and very clearly, "Let go of my arm." It meant staying. Marcus asked me once, in the middle of all of it, one of the hard weeks, when the PSC complaint had just come in and the school visit had just happened and Sandra was calling people at the church, whether I had any regrets. I said, "One." He said, "What?" I said, "I regret that Amara had to watch any of this. That her first years in this house were shadowed by this fight." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Denver. She watched her mother hold her ground. She watched you document and persist and never break. She watched you build a case that changed things for families she'll never meet. That is not a shadow. That is her inheritance." I looked at him. He said, "She's going to carry that her whole life." I said, "I know." He said, "That's not a regret." I thought about it. I said, "No, I guess it's not." In September of the following school year, I started a new unit for my 7th graders, Housing and Community Rights in American History, from Reconstruction through redlining through the Fair Housing Act through the present. It is not in the standard curriculum. I wrote it myself over the summer in the evenings at the kitchen table where I had spread out HOA documents 18 months before. The unit takes 2 weeks. On the last day, I ask students to identify a community problem in their own lives and just outline what a documented, organized, legal response to it might look like. Maya, who is now in 8th grade and comes by to say hello sometimes, stopped by my room during this unit and said, "Is this the new thing you're teaching?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Tell them it works. Tell them from you." I looked at her. I said, "I'll show them." On a Tuesday morning in October, I drove to school, parked in the lot, walked through the front doors of Jefferson Middle School, said good morning to the security guard, poured my coffee in the teacher's lounge, walked to my classroom, arranged the desks in the horseshoe configuration I prefer for discussion, wrote the day's essential question on the board, what does it mean to belong to a community, and what do you do when a community fails you? And waited for 28 seventh graders to come in. They came in talking, backpacks swinging, the specific energy of young people at 8 a.m. who don't yet know what the day holds. I said good morning. They said good morning back. We began. That is the story, or as much of it as I can tell from where I stand, which is here at home in the present tense in a life that is mine. Not every story about injustice ends with the person who caused it in a prison cell or a bankruptcy filing. Some of them end with a consent agreement and a community letter and wind chimes on a back porch and a board that looks like it should. Some of them end with a log that nobody else knew you were keeping, and a voice recording you made just in case, and a colonel who picked up on the second ring, and a woman at the coffee shop who had kept 6 years of minutes because she thought somebody might need them someday. Some of them end with ordinary Tuesday mornings in your own kitchen, in your own home on your own street. That is enough. More than enough. That is, in fact, everything. My daughter asked me last month what I was most proud of. She was working on a school reflection assignment and needed a parent to answer. I thought about it. I said, I'm proud that I didn't leave. She wrote it down. She said, that's it. I said, that's the whole thing, Amara. Everything else came from that. She looked at me the way she looks at me when she is filing something permanently. She wrote it down again, in her careful handwriting. Then she closed her notebook and said, okay, I've got enough. She went back to her room. I sat there for a while. Scout put his head in my lap. I scratched his ears. Outside, the June wind moved through the tulips. Some fights are not fought to win. They are fought to be true. To be a person who could look back at a moment when they were grabbed, when they were dismissed, when they were made to feel small and wrong and out of place in a home they had earned. And no, I did not flinch. I did not yield. I kept the record. I stayed. This is my record. This is my home. The END.